Back in 2018, there was a game that everybody online was calling the Battlefield Killer. Modern combat, huge maps, real-world military hardware, and a focus on realism instead of just arcade chaos. It looked like exactly what thousands of Battlefield fans were asking for at the time. And with an estimated development budget of around $5 to $10 million before publisher investment that would come years later, the game was set to be a hit. Fast forward 8 years later, multiple studio changes, that game is shutting down forever. I don't know the word to call how I'm feeling right now. There's equal parts nostalgia, there's equal parts bitterness, there's equal parts, happy for the good times that we had. For those who don't know, World War III is shutting down today. The World War III servers will be taken offline on August 3rd. After this date, the game will no longer be playable. This was not an easy decision. You have supported us throughout the years, and we want to thank everyone who played World War III, shared feedback, reported issues, created content, and kept the community alive. I say equal parts nostalgia because I actually went back and checked. I've uploaded 51 videos over the course of the last 7 or 8 years on World War III. Back in its heyday, when the game was coming out, it was doing its beta, the launch. This game was one of the games that I really wanted to connect. It was essentially a very grounded, combined arms, Battlefield-like experience, but leaning a little bit more towards the tactical side, a little bit more military-focused. And there was a ton of customization, weapons, vehicles, gadgets, drones, and it was fun at times. There were times where I remember playing the game back in the day, and we got into some crazy firefights like this one here. There were a lot of criticisms that I had of the game. It was nowhere close to perfect, but World War III at the time held a very special place in my heart. It was one of frustration because they just never were able to make it work. When you look at the reviews, even up to this day, the game has always sat around a mix because people could see the potential, but they could just never connect the dots, whether it be server issues or lack of content or, more gameplay focused things like the game mode. At one point, it would take over an hour and it just became a little bit boring and redundant. The game just never connected, but it had so many good qualities. I loved the polished UI. I loved the amount of customization and content around, different weapons, cosmetics for your character, and the unlock and the progression system. I really loved that. And then at one point, the game went free to play. This was about 4 or 5 years ago, maybe even longer now. And once it went free to play and they did their own launcher for a while, and then it came to Steam, once that happened, that was essentially the death knell to a game that was already struggling and already dying. This game, as of right now, has gone through 3 iterations of Battlefield, because I remember when World War III was first announced, the excitement in this community that we had for a game that was attempting to deliver a grounded Battlefield experience. We were psyched. The original trailer looked like this, and I remember being over the moon excited for the possibilities and the potential. And Farm 51, who were a kind of a newer studio at the time, they were working on this game as well as Chernobylite, which is another franchise. And now the studio and whoever owns the game is completely unrecognizable. Farm 51 sold off the rights of this game multiple years ago, like almost 3 years ago, and then it went to a studio named Wishlist Games, and then now we're here. There's another developer involved, new generation game. So the game went free to play as a last ditch effort to try to get people to come and play the game, and when it did, the servers were still fucked. There was still a lack of content, and a lot of the criticisms that we had at the launch and then subsequently after, they still reared their ugly heads in the free-to-play version, and that was really it. This game was announced around the time that Battlefield 5 was struggling to connect with players through their marketing. And if you guys remember back then, EA had come out and it was very controversial. They had the female in the trailer, and then they said, if you don't want to buy it, don't buy it. So everybody was looking for an alternative. World War III had a fucking layup, and they fumbled the ball at launch. They didn't do enough testing worldwide. They had tested some servers in the EU, but they never ever let any of the North American crowd in. And then when the game launched, the North American servers were completely fucked. The game had a decent following and a decent amount of people who were interested in the game, and they could never get it across the finish line. Fast forward to the debacle that was 2042, and World War III is now going free to play, and the servers were still fucked. And they never got their shit together enough to make an impact in the industry. And it's one of those things where that's where the bitterness comes from, because when you play it, you can see that there is something here. And if they just went in a different direction, focused on refining the gunplay, focused on more map content and more modes when the iron was hot, this might have turned out differently. I went back and played some for this video because I knew that it was shutting down, and I wanted to get one last run of World War III just for nostalgia's sake. And the first map that I jumped into was this Asian inspired, we were basically two teams fighting over 1 point. And the game was unrecognizable from the game that I remember covering at launch, 7 or 8 years ago. But then I got onto Polyarny, which if you guys were playing World War III, you recognize the map. This was a staple map from launch. And man, I shed a thug tear for a little bit. It was just kind of like, damn, I wish this game turned out differently. And that's where the bitterness, but also the nostalgia. I'm very much mixed and torn on how I feel, because at the end of the day, World War III is officially dead. And it's weird because, I don't want to say that I'm glad it's dead, but it feels like it's time. You had multiple chances. And the crazy thing is, in this industry, especially in the indie multiplayer space, you don't really get second chances. And World War III was given so much grace by the industry and by the community. We just kept giving them shots. They went on free weekends and they were doing, discounts. I remember at one point the game was like $14, and it was in a decent state at the time for a $14 experience, but it still just wasn't enough to connect with people. And now we're here. When it was first announced back in June, I had so many people hitting me up saying, man, are you going to make a video on it? And I chose not to at the time. It's so much in the past that it's not really relevant now, but I was reminded that the game was shutting down today. I was reminded over the weekend that the game was shutting down, and I figured, you know what? Why not jump in for one last hurrah, see what the game is like. And even up to this day where I say there was so much potential, but they never ever got it right. I was talking about Polyarny and just how good that map was, and how many great memories I have on that map. And, I still spawn in like this.
Our units are taking hold of objective Bravo 2.
Jesus Christ. Yeah, that fucking tracks. And so it's one of those things where I can look back to and relish in the fact that we did have a good time at certain moments throughout its development. But here we are today, 7 or 8 years later. The first time I reviewed the game on Steam was in 2018. And I think it's time, boys. I think we just got to pour one out for World War III. And this is more so to the people that have been following me for that long. If you guys were here during the early days of World War III, I'm sure you could also see the potential that game had. But we watched it and I covered it all, the good, the bad, and the ugly. I actually think that was one of the titles of my videos at the time. I mean, fuck me, I had a patch and a weapon charm in the game like 7 or 8 years ago. I wanted so bad for this game to make it. They just couldn't get their shit together, and here we are, you know, almost a decade later, finally putting the last nail in the coffin. That is World War III. If you guys have been here since the early days, raise the fucking glass. World War III, shout out Farm 51, shout out Wishlist Games, shout out the new developers who bought the IP from the last developers who bought the IP from Farm 51. Shout out New Generation Games for being the ones to finally just call it a fucking day. It's bitter fucking sweet. It's also an interesting thing now that I think about it. There's 51 videos on the channel about World War III. The game was developed by the Farm 51. It feels poetic to just call it here. Am I right? Through the good, the bad, the ups, the downs, the server issues, the game mode design, and everything in between, there are some elements of World War III that I wish developers who were making games in the indie space would actually take. Mainly their character customization, the weapon customization, the amount of actual content in that side of things was phenomenal for an indie game with a decent budget. But World War III is a tried and true example that if your gameplay doesn't hit first, none of that other shit matters. And so I appreciate you guys for following me all these years. I was looking back at some of these videos in preparation to talk about this. 7 years ago, I'm clicking on videos from 7 years ago, and I'm realizing just how far not only we've come, but how far I've grown, how my opinions have shifted and changed, you know, jumping into the game dev space and just seeing how my opinion on certain things have changed. It's pretty surreal to be sitting here this many years later and, you know, somehow feeling positive about a game shutting down. It's a weird, I'm feeling so conflicted here. But I appreciate you guys watching. Shout out to everybody who logged into World War III. Maybe you played a game with me. Maybe you picked up the game from back in the day because you saw one of my videos. The game always had so much potential, but they could never make it across that finish line. Appreciate you guys watching. My name is Big Fry, and I'll see you on the next one.